Sparrows, as seen from my kitchen window. Over the past 50 years, their numbers have more than halved, and now in Britain there is concern at how close we are to losing this once widespread bird, so efforts are underway to increase their numbers. This could not have been more different for Brandon back in 1917. Back then, the sparrows were hated. Brandon Council even put a bounty on the head of every sparrow, with a reward offered for each one killed. Residents were even paid to smash their eggs. The reason? The small birds were threatening the townfolk's very survival. A threat every bit as real as the enemy fighting our lads overseas. By March 1917, food shortages were hitting hard in everyday life. The nation was importing food from overseas just to feed the population, but Brandon, being a rural community, was best placed to provide its own food. However, the war had deprived the town of its farm labourers. Those men who would usually reap the harvest or sow the crops were off fighting in the war. Some farmers, such as Percy Crocker on Brick Kiln Farm near Brandon Hall, even left their crops die over winter because he had no one to harvest them. Some farming did carry on, where men were replaced by less able-bodied men, old-age men, underage boys and women. Sure, the yields were down on previous years, but at least it was something. The trouble was, no one was on hand to counter the threat posed by pests. Rats and sparrows flourished. As their numbers increased, they moved into farms and allotments around Brandon, consuming the crops which were meant for the stomachs of locals. At a council meeting in Brandon, Colonel Basil Spragg declared war on the pests. He had heard that over 300 had been killed in just one haystack near Bury St Edmunds, and questioned if Brandon residents should be compelled to kill the rats on their own land. The council were not for passing a new law about this, and instead preferred a voluntary scheme. Spragg suggested a payment of a penny per rat killed as an incentive. The council agreed, and in May they issued a proclamation for a penny per rat killed, or a shilling for a dozen. Sparrows would bring you twopence for a dozen. Smashing a dozen eggs got you one and halfpenny. Egg groups were formed to go out hunting in the countryside, where children and adults alike raided the nests of sparrows. The council did all within their powers to alleviate the suffering of local residents. Measures included setting aside waste ground, such as plots in the cemetery for use as allotments, and buying in tons of seed potatoes for residents to plant. They were in no mood to tolerate profiteering, so they set up a food control committee to regulate the price of essentials such as milk, butter, potatoes, sugar and meat. Shops then had to register at the post office if they wanted to sell such foods. Sugar, for example, was registered by the Co-op Society, the International Tea Company, along with independent local shopkeepers such as Chalice, Collins, Harvey, Hinnalls, Morris, Neep and Teed. In July, the council prosecuted Alfred Jessup, a market gardener from Mildenhall, for coming into Brandon and selling potatoes at inflated prices. Mary Hunt of Thetford Road had paid in advance for delivery of small but expensive seed potatoes from Jessup, but instead received something looking more like a baking potato. Despite Jessup bringing a number of witnesses to the court in his defence, the court found him guilty. Brandon's Food Control Committee had the power to set their own maximum prices, totally independent from central government. For meat, it was deemed 1 shilling 3pence and halfpenny per pound was sufficient for butcher and customer alike, although butchers could add a halfpenny if they delivered it to their customer. Beef steak could even demand a slightly higher price, but then in order to achieve an average price of 1 shilling 3pence and halfpenny, the butcher would then need to sell other cuts of meat at a reduced price. Brandon's butchers reacted by petitioning the council, saying that auction prices of livestock were rocketing and they could not afford to sell the meat at that price. Brandon's council did not budge. Rules were rules and residents have to be protected. In winter, the committee set about securing tons of potatoes to use in bread making because flour was becoming scarce. An outbreak of measles hit the town in July, with 17 cases being notified to the council. Could the town's poor health be blamed on the food shortages? If there was indeed a negative impact, then it was only going to get worse. Brandon's volunteer training corps, the forerunner to the Home Guard, and whose membership numbered over 200 at the time, swapped their trench digging practices on Brandon Park Estate to assist residents on allotments and vegetable plots. While Brandon was thankful for its own volunteers, it was less grateful to those coming from outside. It was suggested that conscripts who were in training for war were to be housed with locals and put to work on Brandon farms. The locals were not happy. Many of these conscripts came from cities and had no experience of working on the land. What Brandon wanted was their own lads brought back from war to do the jobs that they once did. Of course, our lads would never be released from their military duties. However, the authorities relented in part and diverted the conscripts to areas that were more appreciative. Those who were able to work in town could almost command their own wage. The council roadmen had already seen their wage dramatically increased in the previous year. Then, in May 1917, they got an extra 2 shillings. In September 1917, another 2 shillings, meaning within 5 months they had received a 25% pay increase. The council's own medical officer asked for an increase and saw his annual wage rise from £40 to £50. The council seemingly had the financial means to retain their staff. This could not be said of the Brandon farms and factories, which were struggling with a reduced workforce. Even the Baptist minister, Reverend Cornelius Mensink, took employment at Spartan Works on London Road to assist making artillery shell cases. One Brandon fur factory owner had already lost 40 of his best labourers when another received his call-up papers. Even Brandon's children made sacrifices. The town Sunday schools all agreed to cease handing out sweets and other treats to the children. Children across the nation were encouraged to put any spare pennies they might have into war savings, which the government could then use to further the war effort. The Brandon School was divided into 3 saving groups, each one given an inspirational name. The infants were named Endeavour and were set up with 68 pupils. The older girls were named Victory and had 72 members, while the older boys, 60 of them, had their group named Excelsior. At the end of 1917, Colonel Spragg, so impressed at the fact the children had collectively saved hundreds of pounds over the year, added to their total by giving each child a 6pence to put into their savings. As I said earlier, it became almost impossible to find any able-bodied men to go into the factories and farms of Brandon. So for any left in town, the compulsion to go to war simply increased daily. The tribunals increasingly argued over whether middle-aged men or men with responsible positions in town should go to war. The Brandon Co-op argued that their baker, who they said was baking over 1,700 loaves of bread a week, should stay in town. The shop announced he was the most important baker in town. The panel judging on the tribunal consented to allow the baker to stay, on condition he promised to bake bread for all the other bakers in town. Although this meant the co-op kept their baker, it also meant certain enlistment for all the other bakers of Brandon. No one was safe from enlistment, or so it seemed. In October, the tribunal panel heard from a Brandon man who had received his call-up papers for the 2nd time and who had been passed as Class A fitness, the highest category of fitness for the army, but who instead argued his need to stay in town. The army representative on the panel, a Captain Willoughby, took a dim view of this man. The Royal Army Medical Corps doctors thought that you were quite fit, and anyhow, the work that you've got in hand is work that could be done by a man not in Class A. The man, a Mr. Frederick Joseph Mount, replied, I don't stand before you as a shirker. If I am wanted for the army, I must go. I am a hard-working man and hold a lot of important positions. I am still assistant overseer for 2 parishes and a coal merchant and a whiting and lime manufacturer, besides being engaged on a great deal of honorary work such as secretary to the Brandon War Savings Association. Captain Willoughby again countered the argument. I appreciate your work in that direction, but your work could be done by a man not fit for general service. Mount responded, Mine is a one-man business. Captain Willoughby again, You are a partner. Yes, but my mother is 72 years of age, responded Mount. The chairman, a Mr. Albert Rout, had the final say. We may never know whether his judgment was swayed by the fact both he and Mount, along with many of the tribunal panel, had served together on the council and various other committees in Brandon. However, his judgment saw that Mr. Mount was exempted from going to war, at least for a few more months. There was a certain symbolism in November when the council discussed the town's bridge, a structure which had stood for centuries but which was crumbling under the strain of heavy trucks carrying pit props for the war effort. It seemed, like that bridge, life in Brandon was also under a great deal of stress. The cracks were only going to get wider.